Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy Roll Good. Today we're actually going to cover the most useful resistances in the Dungeons & Dragons, at least according to the new monster manual. I know about like a month ago or a month or two ago, the Dungeon Dudes did a similar video where they talked about what the best damage types are, as like what are the best damage types that you could take into a campaign if you're going in blind, at least according to the new monster manual. But one thing I don't think I've seen anyone do yet is talk about what are the best resistances that you can have going into an adventure if you're going in blind, for example. And again, according to the new monster manual. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. So I took my spreadsheet from the 2025 monster manual. I already actually had all of the damage types that all the monsters deal in there. So I already had all the numbers. I just needed to get the counts and everything for it. So that's what we're going to look at today. So let's go ahead and get right into it. We'll get started first with the actual monster damage counts, and unsurprisingly, damage for piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning damage. These are of course the most prominent damage types among all monsters. And in most cases, those damage types resistances, like when you are getting resistance to those damage types, that's usually grouped together. It's very rare to have resistance to only one of those types. But if you had to pick one, again, not knowing what you're going up against, you'd be best off going against piercing. Slashing coming in second, with bludgeoning not far behind. It doesn't actually surprise me that bludgeoning is the least common. Piercing being the most common makes some sense here, because you think of all like the bite attacks that would be piercing, stabbing with like rapiers, daggers, they're very common weapon types. Slashing again being second, not very surprising, because if there's teeth, there's usually also claws. Claws do slashing. Again, axe weapons, slashing weapons, and then again bludgeoning weapons are just the least common weapon type as well. So it's not surprising to see that also translated to the monster stats. But we're talking about the non-physical damage types. We see poison being the most common occurrence in the new monster manual, followed by necrotic. Necrotic being the second most common non-physical type is maybe a little bit surprising, but maybe not if you think about just like how prominent undead creature types are, and that they would probably usually do necrotic. I do have the breakout by creature type. I think that might be later in this. If not, I forgot that, but I believe it's later on in the video. Next being fire being common, again unsurprising. Psychic being in the middle is actually a bit surprising, especially considering how rare of a resistance it is to have, and we'll get those numbers in a second. Force being right under psychic, again also very surprising. Force damage is very prevalent within the 2025 monster manual. And force is then followed by acid, which is then followed by radiant. Those are pretty much neck and neck. Cold and lightning are equally represented in the new monster manual, and then thunder takes up the last spot. And thunder being the last isn't super surprising. Cold and lightning being so low is, and the way that I did this is that each damage type only counts once. So like, for example, if a creature has like a dagger attack that does piercing, and then they have like cone of cold that does cold damage, but then they also have ice knife that does piercing and cold damage, that counts as one occurrence of piercing damage and one occurrence of cold damage. It is just once per monster. I thought about doing weights if it were like a repeatable source, like something they could do every turn versus like a legendary action versus a once per day sort of thing. That would have taken a lot of time, and I don't know that it's actually useful at the end of the day, so I didn't end up doing that. But it's only one type of damage per creature, so it's just how many creatures does this damage type occur on. So those are all the monster damage types. Now let's compare those to the resistances that are available to players and how those are ranked. Cold damage is here at the top, and then force damage, of course, unsurprisingly being at the bottom. These are ranked by resistances from either species, feats, or class or subclass features. It does not include resistances that you can get from magic items or spells, because I can't predict what magic items you might have access to or what spells that you might choose. But if we look at how these things are kind of compared to each other, we can see that psychic is the only one that's sort of aligned with itself. Poison, necrotic, and radiant are all within like one rank of each other. And then force is the least common type of damage to be able to find resistance to. It's sort of in the middle of the pack according to the monster damage types in the monster manual. But again, that's only 40, and I think it was 40 in the last slide. Let me double check that real quick. Yeah, 40 creatures in the new monster manual have it out of 505, so it's still very rare to find force damage, but of all the damage types, it is again middle of the pack there. And then for maybe the biggest gap, we have bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing. So those are the most common damage types, again, of course, unsurprisingly among monsters, but it is actually one of the rarest damage resistance types that you can get. Of course, when you can get it, it's usually like almost permanent, like with the barbarian getting it during rage. Class or subclass features can get it with like part of their capstone. I know like the cleric has one. I think one of the paladins has one as well. But in terms of just being able to sort of easily get it without specifically going into the barbarian, or like the rune knight fighter gets it temporarily as well, it's actually very rare to have resistances to that kind of damage. So what do the counts for player resistances actually look like then? So if we look at the counts, again, we're only including species, feats, and then class and subclass features. And all resistances were counted once, even if you can only choose one from multiple, like the Dragonborn, for example, you can only choose one resistance type. So that counts as a resistance from one of each, because that is is a source of that type of resistance. Circumstantial and temporary resistances, such as like the Shadar-Kai's bonus action teleport, Misty Step sort of thing that gives them resistance to all damage until the beginning of their next turn. That counts as a resistance for one of everything. Whether or not it's permanent or temporary counts towards the resistance for that damage. Immunity is also included in these counts. So looking at that, cold, fire, poison, and lightning and acid being in the top 4 isn't super surprising, but I would say psychic is maybe higher than I would have expected. I know there are a few things like the psionic subclasses, of course, get psychic resistance. There's a few species. There's a lot more species than there originally were for sure in 2014 that now come with psychic resistance. That's usually, the main filler for the old Bear Totem Barbarian pre-2024, that they wanted to get psychic resistance from somewhere so they could have resistance to all damage. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well, because that has changed in 2024 and how that is still possible within the new rules. But we can see at the bottom that resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing is almost as rare as force resistance. So there are 19 different sources of force resistance. Again, many of those are probably the temporary bonuses, such as like the resistant to all damage until the beginning of your next turn sort of thing. There's only a few sources of just blanket force resistance, and again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. The one extra count of bludgeoning resistance comes from the Dao Warlock, the Genie Warlock, that gets resistance to the damage type of their patron, and it's bludgeoning for the Dao. So that's where that extra resistance comes from. So then let's look at the actual resistances from the species then. So of course, PHB 2024 means it's from the new player's handbook. MOTM is Monsters of the Multiverse. Spelljammer, of course, is Spelljammer. Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft is here, Eberron, and then of course Fizban's Treasury of Dragons there at the bottom. So we can see that there's a fair amount of poison resistance. Poison was a very common damage type for monsters, but also then necrotic was the second most common non-physical damage type, and you can see that there are actually a fair amount of sources of necrotic resistance, either from the Aasimar Shadar-Kai, again has that temporary bonus, or the Gem Dragonborn can get blanket resistance to necrotic damage. The new Tieflings as well in the player's handbook can also get it because they can choose between Tiefling lineage types, whether you're like the Fiendish, Chthonic, or Abyssal Tiefling. The Chthonic Tiefling has the necrotic resistance. Secondly, we can see that, again, like I said before, that there are a number of sources of psychic resistance as well. Both of the Gith races have it. The Kalashtar was a common, again, gap filler for that barbarian early on. And then, of course, the Gem Dragonborn have that psychic choice as well. Radiant damage, which wasn't uncommon either among the damage types in the new Master Manual, is not very common. We can see it in the Aasimar as well as, again, in the Gem Dragonborn, which, again, the Gem Dragonborn covers a lot of the rarer resistances. You can see that Force is on there as well. But remember that you can only pick one. Aasimar is actually kind of unique here because it is the only species that gets 2 permanent resistances. So if you were trying to make a build that covers all your resistances, you'd probably end up going with either the Aasimar or maybe a different option, because it comes with 2 of some of the harder resistances to get as a player character at least. So those are all the resistances from species. Let's go ahead and look at the resistances from feats. So starting off, we have the Boon of Energy Resistance. Again, from the Player's Handbook, we have Bigby Presents Glory of the Giants, Fizban's again, Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Planescape, Adventures in the Multiverse, and then the old Player's Handbook with a small caveat there. Some of these are temporary, like the thing that happens as a reaction from the Gift of the Chromatic Dragon, or the, the Guile of the Cloud Dragon also is a reaction, sort of like an Absorb Elements sort of feature. You have like the Epic Boon of the Night Spirit, which is sort of conditional, where you need to be in dim light or darkness. Using feats is kind of difficult to get, easy passive resistances at least. One of the big standouts here, of course, is Infernal Constitution, which gives you resistance to both cold and poison damage. This, of course, requires the prerequisite of being a Tiefling, and it does conflict a little bit with the Abyssal Tiefling in the 2024 Player's Handbook because they already have poison resistance. This one was designed with the old Tiefling in mind that had fire resistance, and then gives them fire, cold, and poison. The whole point of Infernal Constitution is that you're basically much more connected to your bloodline as far as being from, this one to be from the Nine Hells, which commonly have fire, cold, and poison resistance. But yeah, that requires the Tiefling. I think another cool call out here is the Scion of the Outer Planes feat. This one is specifically for and from the Planescape Adventures in the Multiverse campaign. But if you are a very lax DM, or you have a very lax DM who doesn't really care what feats you choose, and you have the permission to choose this one, of course, you do have the ability to pick up this one, and you can get either force damage resistance, you can get necrotic, radiant, or psychic damage as well. Poison is here included as well, but you have 4 very rare resistance types. Again, you choose only one when you pick the feat, but at least Infernal Constitution and Sign of the Outer Planes are probably the best ways to get good passive resistances. There's like Ember of the Fire Giant and Fury of the Frost Giant as well. Those both have a prerequisite of having Strike of the Giants. If you're choosing Scion of the Outer Planes and you're able to pick up Planar Wanderer as well, you can also pick up Acid, Cold, or Fire. And then, of course, when you're at higher levels, that Boon of Energy Resistance can give you 2 floating resistances to most of the resistances except for force damage, and you can change those out depending on what context of the fight that you're going into. And then, of course, at the bottom we have Dungeon Delver, which technically gives you resistance to all damage as long as that damage is from a trap. So that is technically considered legacy content on D&D Beyond, although there's no replacement for it in the 2024 Player's Handbook. I don't know if they just thought that that feat was useless and then got rid of it. Didn't feel like coming up with a better one, but technically it kind of still exists, even though I don't know how many people actually take it. If you've ever actually taken the Dungeon Delver feat and, something very cool happened because you had that feat, definitely let me know down in the comments because I love to hear those kinds of stories. So we've covered the resistances from species, we've covered them now from feats. Let's look at the resistances we can get from class features, not subclass features, but class features. Of course, we start with the Barbarian. They get resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage at level 1 as long as rage is active. A level 18 monk has superior defense. They get resistance to all but force damage for 1 minute, but it costs 3 focus points for them to do it. And again, that's a level 18 feature, so they need to wait quite a long time for that unless you're doing a high level one-shot or adventure. And then of course you have the Artificer's Resistant Armor Infusion, which is requires level 6 or higher, and you can choose one damage type from Acid, Cold, Fire, Force, Lightning, Necrotic, Poison, Psychic, Radiant, or Thunder. We can pick only one when you do that infusion. I know they revised the Artificer recently, and that'll be coming out in the new Eberron book later this year. I don't remember if Resistant Armor was in the UA off the top of my head, and of course we don't actually know what is making it into the final product, so we'll have to wait and see what that actually looks like later on. So then let's go class by class and look at resistances that we can get from subclasses. So starting with the Barbarian, if you are the Rage of the Wilds, the sort of replacement for the Bear Totem in 2024, they now have resistance to every type but Force, Necrotic, Psychic, and Radiant while raging. It used to be only except Psychic while raging in 2014, but of course in 2024 they infamously removed some of those resistances. The Ancestral Protector's Barbarian, which is from Xanathar's Guide to Everything at level 3 or higher, while you're raging, when you hit one creature during your turn with an attack, you can cause attacks that creature deals to any creature other than you be treated as though that creature whose hit has resistance. So that's actually a very unique ability because it's basically giving your entire party resistance to all damage from that specific creature if they make an attack against them. Again, it's like a soft taunt, which is something that the Ancestral Protectors does very, very well. And then for the Zealot Barbarian, there's the Rage of the Gods that gives them Necrotic, Psychic, and Radiant resistance for 1 minute after activating Rage. This is at level 14 or higher. And then lastly, the Storm Herald Barbarian has Storm Soul. This gives them either Fire, Cold, or Lightning, depending on the Storm aura of your choice. That is the Barbarian. Let's go ahead and move on to the Cleric. The War Cleric has Avatar of Battle at level 17 or higher. This is their capstone where they just have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. The Forge domain has Soul of the Forge at level 6 or higher, and then Saint of Forge and Fire at level 17 plus. The level 6 version, of course, gives resistance to fire damage, and that is upgraded to immunity on their capstone. And then the Nature domain has Dampen Elements, which gives resistance to Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, or Thunder as a reaction when you or another creature within 30 feet take damage of that type. Moving on then to the Druid. The Circle of the Land Druid has Nature's Ward in 2024. This gives you fire, cold, lightning, or poison resistance depending on your current land type, which I believe you switch out during a long rest. You can switch which land type you're associated with and change your resistance that way if that's something you're trying to do strategically. The Circle of the Sea in 2024 has the Stormborn feature at level 10 or higher that gives cold, lightning, and thunder damage while Wrath of the Sea is active. Wrath of the Sea is their alternate use of Wild Shape. And then the Circle of Stars Druid gets bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage while Starry Form is active. And again, Starry Form, of course, is their alternate use of Wild Shape. So that's the Druid. Let's go ahead and move on then to the Fighter. The Cavalier Fighter has the Warding Maneuver feature. This is at level 7 or higher. So this is resistance that you can give to an ally that is within 5 feet of you. And you can do it a number of times equal to your con modifier per long rest. So the way that this works is that you increase their AC by a certain amount, and if that attack still hits, they are treated as resistant to that attack. The Psy Warrior at level 7 or higher has just passive psychic resistance. And then the Rune Knight Fighter at level 7 or higher with the Hill Rune, similar to a Barbarian's Rage, gets resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing for 1 minute. They can do this once per long rest or twice per long rest at level 15 or higher in that subclass. Moving on then to the Monk. The Warrior of the Elements Monk has Elemental Epitome. You choose one from Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, or Thunder, and you can change that resistance at the start of each of your turns if you would need to do that for whatever reason. But of course, this also requires you to be level 17 or higher. The Way of the Ascendant Dragon has Aspect of the Worm at level 11 or higher, where you choose one from Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, or Poison for 1 minute. This also creates a 30-foot emanation that protects your allies within that radius as well, and you can do this once per long rest, or you can spend 3 focus points to re-up it again. But again, remember, you're only picking one type of damage. So then moving on to the Paladin, we have the Oath of the Ancients Paladin, where you can get passive resistance to necrotic, psychic, or radiant damage while in your aura of protection. This is, of course, at level 7 or higher. Oath of Conquest has Invincible Conqueror that gives you resistance to all damage for 1 minute after activating this ability as an action. You can do that once per long rest. Redemption Paladin has Emissary of Redemption that gives you resistance to all damage from creatures that you haven't attacked, cast a spell on, or damaged other than through this feature. So that's a very interesting one. I don't know if it's possible to actually build around that in a way that is still effective and makes sense, but I really think that feature is interesting. I might do a video about that one later on if I find something cool to do with it. Oath of the Crown has Exalted Champion at level 20. This gives you resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical weapons for 1 hour once per long rest. This one probably needs to be updated to the 2020 rules. You could probably just make it, all bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, period. And then finally, the Oathbreaker has Supernatural Resistance, which is resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical weapons, just passive. If you're updating this one, I don't know if you'd let it be completely passive. Maybe you would. Maybe you'd change it a little bit or just change the damage type resistance in general. But you know what? Let me know down in the comments how you would change Supernatural Resistance for 2024 rules. Moving on from the Paladin, we then have the Ranger. The Hunter Ranger can give themselves resistance to any damage as a reaction. The Drake Warden has Bond of Fang and Scale. They can give themselves Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, or Poison resistance. This is the same type as your Dragon Companion's Essence when you summon them. The Drake Warden at level 15 or higher also has a separate reaction they can use when they take damage or when their Drake takes damage. They can do this a number of times equal to their proficiency bonus per long rest. The Horizon Walker gets Spectral Defense, where they can do it when they get hit by an attack against any type of damage. And then finally, the Swarm Keeper, again, as a reaction when you take damage, they can give themselves resistance to it. So those are all very, very similar features across many of the Ranger subclasses. I never actually noticed that before until I did this video, and so I don't know if that's like a weird sign that the Ranger really was sort of the redheaded stepchild of Wizards of the Coast, and maybe they need a little bit more love, a little bit more diversity in their features. Not that these are bad features by any means, but having the same feature at basically the same level across all of your subclasses is a little unimaginative, I guess I would say. But moving on from the Ranger, we're going to take a look at the Sorcerer. The level 6 Aberrant Sorcerer has Psychic Defenses for psychic damage resistance. Draconic Sorcery at level 6 or higher can choose one from Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, or Poison associated with your Draconic ancestry. The Wild Magic Sorcerer at level 3 or higher, if you roll a 33 through 36 on the Wild Magic Surge table in the new player's handbook, you get resistance to all damage for 1 minute. The Lunar Sorcerer can get Necrotic and Radiant while in their Crescent Moon phase. The level 18 or higher Lunar Sorcerer can get resistance to all damage as a bonus action until the start of your next turn, as long as you're within the Crescent Moon phase. The Shadow Sorcerer at level 18 or higher can get all but Force and Radiant for 1 minute after activating the Umbral Form ability. The Storm Sorcerer can get Lightning and Thunder resistance at level 6, and then this upgrades to full immunity at level 18 or higher. And outside of magic items or very specific spells, I think this is the only feature that gives you more than one immunity to damage. Like there's the Forge Domain Cleric that gives you immunity to fire at this level, but this is the only subclass feature that gives you immunity to 2 types of damage passively. So that's pretty cool. So then moving on to the Warlock, we have the Celestial Patron at level 6, gives you Radiant resistance. The Fathomless Patron gives you Cold resistance at level 6 or higher. The Genie Patron gives you Bludgeoning, Thunder, Fire, or Cold, depending on what your Genie Patron choice was. Undead Patron gives you Necrotic at level 10 or higher. They also give you resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing for up to 1 hour at level 14 or higher. The Fiend Patron actually gives you a floating resistance that you can change once per short or long rest. You can choose any damage type but force, and then you have resistance to that damage until you change it. And then finally, the Great Old One Patron at level 10 or higher has resistance to psychic damage. So moving on from Warlock, we then have the Wizard. The Necromancy Wizard has resistance to necrotic damage at level 10 or higher. And then the Transmutation Wizard at level 6 or higher can choose one from Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, or Thunder. You choose this when you create your stone, and you can change that resistance type to one of the other ones listed here when you cast a transmutation spell of level 1 or higher. And then finally, for the subclass features, we of course have the Artificer. The Alchemist Artificer has acid and poison resistance at level 15 or higher as their subclass capstone. And while I didn't include resistances from spells and magic items in my initial counts, I did want to kind of go through and list those real quick here, at least from what I could find. So resistances to spells, these are what they look like here from 1st through 9th level. You can see that there's no resistances or immunities to spells at level 7, but at least every other spell level has something that you can choose from depending on what your class is, of course. I'm not going to stop to read each one here, but you can kind of pause to read if you're interested in that sort of thing. And then also magic items that have resistances. Again, I probably didn't get everything because I don't have all the source books available, but from a quick search, here's all the magic items that give you some sort of resistance or immunity even. You're welcome to look those up. I'm positive that I probably missed some that I don't have access to because I don't have those books, but this should be at least the lion's share of them. But probably most famously, pre-2024 at least, the most famous way to get resistance to all damage types was to be, the Path of the Totem Barbarian and choose the Bear Totem. Resistance to all damage except Psychic, and then you just have to get Psychic from being a Kalistar or a Gith or whatever the other one was. I can't remember off the top of my head. But is the return of the Barbarian still possible within the 2024 rules? And of course it is. They do have a larger gap to fill, but it is relatively easy to fill it. It does take a little bit longer to come online, but it does require you to make some more specific choices. So I'm going to outline two methods here that give you this as early as possible while only using species, feats, and class features. The first one is the Barbarilladin, which is going to be a gem dragon choosing the force damage resistance type. You can take 3 levels of Path of the Wildheart Barbarian. This of course gives you resistance to all damage except force, necrotic, psychic, and radiant while raging. And then you would need to take 7 levels of Oath of the Ancients Paladin, which would give you the paladin aura that covers necrotic, psychic, and radiant damage. So you have to wait considerably longer to do that. And without having to pick up, setting specific feats, this gives you the most consistent all resist while also making the fewest number of choices. A con to this is that barbarians and paladins don't work together nearly as well as they used to pre-2024, mainly because now smiting is considered casting a spell, and of course you can't cast a spell while raging. But if you wanted to play something like that, you can consider that sort of like a defense mode versus an offense mode, where you're in defense mode while raging and you still get a little bit of extra damage from your rage damage bonus. But then if you wanted to do smites and do a lot of damage, then you can end your rage and then smite away or do whatever you want to do. So you kind of have to choose between offense and defense. You can't quite do both, unfortunately. Unless, of course, you have a very friendly DM who's maybe giving you that as a bonus or something like that. The second option requires some more specific choices, but that is going to be the Cyber attack, like a cyber attack, joke, haha, funny. You would need to be an Azamar to get necrotic and radiant resistances. You'll choose Sign of the Outer Planes feat to get force damage resistance. And again, we'll take 3 levels of Path of the Wildheart Barbarian to get the resistances there. And then take 7 levels of the Psy Warrior Fighter to get the psychic damage resistances. So the pros here, of course, is that you have no conflict between spellcasting and raging like you do with the paladin version of it. The cons, of course, is that it technically requires the Planescape campaign. So if you're not able to choose the Scion of the Outer Planes feat for that reason, then you're kind of out of luck. And if you get hit by force damage, you're just gonna have to deal with it. Technically, you could do this just a little bit faster by taking 6 levels in Artificer for the Armor of Resistance to get that psychic damage resistances instead. That gives you the all resist 1 level earlier. But again, you have conflicts between spellcasting and raging as well, whereas the Psy Warrior doesn't have that problem. Fighter in general is just much more synergistic with the Barbarian than the Artificer. But if you wanted to technically do it the fastest, that would technically be the fastest way to get all resists. And this is, of course, again, not using any spells or very specific magic items that you can't get from not being an Artificer. So it certainly still is possible. I mean, even though we've went through this whole video talking about what are the most common damage types from monsters and how do we get resistance to all the damage types to make sure that, of course, that we're never taking full damage. The question at the end of the day is that really important? Do we really need to be resistant to all damage at all the times? And most of the time that answer is going to be no. The big thing here that also matters when you're thinking about what kind of damage type should you be dealing is that context is important, right? You're going to take different damage types into different situations all the time, and that goes for resistances as well. So we can see that on the left side, we have the types of creatures that you could run into, what the most common damage type among them is that isn't bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage. And then we have the least common damage type as well, which can include bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage if it is the lowest or one of the lowest damage types among them. So this is just all to say that if you know you're going to go against aberrations, of course, you probably be looking for a psychic damage resistance. If you're going against elementals, whatever the elemental type you're going against, you want resistance to that damage because fire elementals do fire damage, thunder elementals do thunder damage, that sort of thing. Weird standouts here is that humanoids mostly do radiant damage, at least according to the numbers. Undead, unsurprisingly, do a lot of necrotic damage. Plants do a lot of thunder damage, apparently, as well as the Fae and beasts. Beasts I think that's unsurprising that beasts would do a lot of thunder damage. And, again, going on the theme that context is important, dragons, of course. Dragons specifically do usually one type of damage depending on their dragon type. So whether you're going up against a specific kind of monster or you're going into a specific adventure module, if you're going into Rime of the Frost Maiden, going in there with cold resistance probably is going to serve you pretty well. If you're doing Curse of Strahd, getting necrotic, poison, maybe fire damage resistance is going to be pretty good for you as well. If you're going into Descent into Avernus, fire, poison, maybe lightning, if I'm thinking off the top of my head, maybe cold damage as well. Celestials get some radiant damage resistance. So unless you're really going in completely blind, I don't think it ever really serves us too well to pick up, as many resistances as, or maybe you don't need to try so hard for passive damage resistances as if you can have situational or reactive resistance through some features, or you just don't think about it at all. We did Rime of the Frost Maiden, and while I knew that going in there with cold resistance would probably benefit me, I don't always like being that on the nose when I build characters, and sometimes I kind of find it kind of cheap to be that on the nose. So you can also just kind of fly by the seat of your pants. Maybe you have some passive resistances if you just chose to be an Aasimar because you wanted to be one, and then when that resistance comes up, you're just kind of, you kind of got lucky, I guess. But it's everything I wanted to cover in this video. Again, we covered all the most common damage types that monsters deal according to the 2025 Monster Manual. We covered the most common resistances and where you get them from for as a player character. And then we broke that down into the, you know, the species, feat, and, you know, class and subclass features and where you get those from. So I hope all this information was helpful to you. If there's a faster way to get all resistances than what I outlined here, definitely let me know. Of course, there's things like warding, bond, and spells that can give you all resists much earlier. But I think that the real dream is not having to spend a resource on it if you don't have to. And so unless you're committing to the bit of always casting warding bond, then, you know, having it passively through, you know, feats and, you know, class features and whatever else, I think just makes the most sense to me. And it's the most fun thought experiment. But yeah, that's everything I wanted to cover. Let me know down in the comments what you thought about everything I covered in this video. Have you ever like gone out of your way to make a character that has the most resistances possible that is maybe a less traditional path than going the, you know, Bear Totem Barbarian route? And, you know, what was that build like? I'd love to know things like that as well. So while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.